On January 26, 1996, a man drove a car slowly across an 800-acre estate in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. He stopped in the driveway in front of a small house. A wrestler named Dave Schultz walked toward the car and said hello. The man inside pointed a gun and fired 3 times. The third bullet hit Schultz in the back as he fell. His wife watched from a few feet away. The man who pulled the trigger was John DuPont. He was 57 years old. He was the heir to one of the greatest industrial fortunes in American history. He was found guilty of third-degree murder in 1997. He died in prison in 2010. He was not the first member of the DuPont family to be destroyed by the fortune that surrounded him. He was not the last. The family that built the empire behind the fortune began with a French refugee who arrived in America with a chemistry education and a grievance about the quality of American gunpowder. They ended in the direct line of family control over the company they founded, when a corporation in Delaware quietly passed out of family hands and into the global chemical market. What happened in between is one of the longest, strangest, and most consequential stories in American industrial history. Chapter 1. The chemist who fled the revolution. Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours was born in Paris in 1739, the son of a watchmaker. He became an economist, a government official, a physiocrat, a believer in the natural order of wealth flowing from land and production, and a minor figure in the court of Louis XVI. He was the kind of man who advised Jefferson on the Louisiana Purchase and Hamilton on tariff policy while running printing operations in Paris. He was also the kind of man whose printing office was wrecked by revolutionary mobs when the political weather shifted. By the 1790s, France had become dangerous for anyone who had served the monarchy. When the Reign of Terror arrived, Pierre was arrested. He survived only because Robespierre was executed before his own execution could be arranged. In 1800, Pierre took his family to America. He arrived in Rhode Island on January 1, 1800, with 2 sons and a plan to establish a self-sufficient agricultural colony in the new republic. The colony plan failed almost immediately. His younger son, Eleuthère Irénée, had a different idea. Irénée had spent his youth apprenticed to the greatest chemist in France. Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry and director of the Royal Gunpowder and Saltpeter Administration, had taught Irénée the craft of manufacturing black powder at the government mills at Essonne. Irénée had learned it completely and precisely. When he arrived in America, he went hunting. What he found in his powder flask confirmed what he had suspected. American gunpowder was poor quality, expensive, and imported. The country that had just won a revolution, partly by shooting at British soldiers, had no reliable domestic source of the powder that made the shooting possible. Irénée saw the gap. He returned to France to find investors. He raised capital from French backers who hoped to strengthen Franco-American economic ties. He secured technical equipment and mill plans from the French government. He returned to Delaware with everything he needed except the land. On July 19, 1802, he purchased 95 acres along the Brandywine River near Wilmington, Delaware. He paid $6,740 for the site. The water power was already there. The willow trees that would provide charcoal for gunpowder manufacture grew along the banks. The port of Wilmington, where sulfur and saltpeter could be delivered, was nearby. He named the mill Eleutherian Mills in honor of freedom. The family's first American estate sat on the hill above the mills. They lived directly above what they were manufacturing. The first gunpowder went on public sale in 1804. By 1805, sales had tripled. The federal government became a regular customer. During the War of 1812, the United States government bought powder from DuPont in quantities that transformed a struggling mill into a major enterprise. Irénée carried substantial debt for the 32 years he ran the company. He never fully resolved it. He also never fully resolved the question of what it meant to run an enterprise whose primary product could kill people who stood too close to it. In March of 1818, an explosion at the mills killed 40 workers and destroyed 5 mill buildings. Irénée carried loans for the rest of his life to pension the widows and orphans left behind. He rebuilt and continued. He died on October 31, 1834, at the age of 63. His sons Alfred and Henry carried on. The mills kept running. The company kept growing. The family that would own it for the next century and a half had arrived. Chapter 2. Gunpowder, War, and Monopoly. For 100 years after Irene's death, the DuPont company grew by following the simplest possible business model. America kept fighting wars. Wars required gunpowder. DuPont made gunpowder. During the Civil War, the Brandywine mills produced nearly a third of all the gunpowder used by the Union Army. Wartime production accelerated so aggressively that on February 26, 1863, the packing room exploded, destroying 10,000 pounds of powder and killing 13 men. The mills rebuilt. The orders kept coming. By 1881, the DuPont Company controlled 85% of the American explosives market. They had done it through a combination of genuine innovation, aggressive acquisition of competitors, and the kind of cartel-style price-fixing arrangements that the late 19th century regarded as simply good business. After the Civil War, DuPont organized the Gunpowder Trade Association, an arrangement among leading explosives manufacturers that coordinated pricing and divided markets to prevent the kind of competition that might have driven prices down. It worked for decades. By 1902, DuPont operated 40 gunpowder and explosives plants across the country and controlled nearly two-thirds of the entire American explosives market. Then the man who was supposed to keep the company in family hands died. Eugene DuPont, the company's president, died unexpectedly in January of 1902. The older generation of family partners discussed selling the company to a competitor. 3 younger cousins stepped in with a different proposal. They would buy it themselves. Alfred Irene DuPont, Thomas Coleman DuPont, and Pierre Samuel DuPont were childhood friends who had grown up on the Brandywine. They were spectacularly different in temperament. Coleman was large, loud, confident, and political. Alfred was impulsive, rebellious, and irreverent. He called the family mansion on the Brandywine Swamp Hall to mock the other DuPont's tendency to name their estates after French locations. Pierre was methodical, precise, and financially gifted. Together they were worth almost nothing. Apart they owned a company. They structured a deal that would today be called a leveraged buyout. They issued bonds to be paid by the company's future profits, offered them to existing shareholders in exchange for their stock, and sweetened the arrangement with shares in the reorganized enterprise. The actual cash required from the 3 cousins themselves was $2,100, $700 each, for lawyers' fees. They took control of one of the largest industrial enterprises in America for $700 apiece. Under their direction, DuPont acquired 54 additional companies within 3 years. By 1905, the firm controlled 75% of the American gunpowder market. The federal government's response arrived in 1907. The Department of Justice filed antitrust proceedings under the Sherman Act. The courts ruled against DuPont in 1911. 2 new companies, Hercules Powder and Atlas Powder, were carved from DuPont's holdings. DuPont was told to plan its own dissolution and permitted to oversee the execution of that plan. Both new companies were staffed almost entirely by former DuPont executives. DuPont itself retained its monopoly on smokeless powder for military use. 3 years later, the First World War broke out in Europe. DuPont's revenues from powder and explosive sales rose from $25 million in 1914 to $319 million by 1918. The 5-year total across the war period came to $1,245,000,000. The Merchant of Death. That was what critics called the company. The DuPonts preferred to call it patriotism and profit simultaneously achieved. Chapter 3. The family turns on itself. Coleman DuPont wanted to sell his shares in 1915. He was in poor health and needed cash for other investments. He approached Pierre one afternoon and offered to sell at $160 per share. Pierre told Alfred. Alfred said the price was too high. He suggested $125. Alfred assumed they were opening a negotiation. Pierre treated the response as a rejection. Pierre quietly and quickly purchased Coleman's shares for himself at the asking price. He did not tell Alfred he was doing it. When Alfred discovered the transaction, he immediately understood what it meant. Pierre had become the dominant shareholder. Pierre was now in control. Alfred launched a lawsuit. He argued that Pierre had acted as an agent of the company and owed a duty to purchase on the company's behalf rather than his own. He lost. The cousins who had saved the company together in 1902 spent the rest of their lives in a state of declared war. Alfred was stripped of his operational responsibilities. He was effectively pushed out of the company he had risked everything to keep in family hands. When Pierre was named tax commissioner of Delaware in 1925, Alfred took his third wife Jessie and moved to Jacksonville, Florida, where he spent the rest of his life investing in land and banking. He never returned to Delaware. He died in 1935, leaving his fortune to a charitable trust that became the Alfred Versus DuPont Testamentary Trust, focused on children's health care. The family had eaten itself. Pierre took what Alfred would have fought for. Alfred left the state of his birth rather than live alongside the cousin who had taken it from him. Pierre, meanwhile, had moved DuPont into its next phase entirely. He had begun buying General Motors stock in 1914. DuPont invested $50 million in GM between 1917 and 1919, becoming its largest stockholder. In 1920, Pierre became president of General Motors. Under his leadership, with Alfred Sloan eventually running day-to-day operations, GM became the largest automobile company in the world. The Gunpowder family from Delaware now controlled the American automobile industry. Chapter 4. Better Living Through Chemistry. In a DuPont laboratory in Deepwater, New Jersey in 1938, a 27-year-old chemist named Roy Plunkett was trying to create a new version of Freon. He and his assistant discovered that a frozen, compressed sample of a fluorocarbon gas had spontaneously polymerized into a white, waxy, slippery solid. It was unlike anything they had produced intentionally. The material was extraordinarily stable. It was resistant to virtually every chemical that touched it. Nothing stuck to it, nothing dissolved it, nothing reacted with it. DuPont trademarked it in 1945. They called it Teflon. The introduction of Teflon was the beginning of DuPont's transformation from a gunpowder company into something more complex, more powerful, and more dangerous in ways that would not become apparent for decades. The company had already given the world nylon, introduced in 1938, the same year as Teflon's accidental discovery. Nylon stockings went on sale in 1940 and sold out immediately. Nylon, Teflon, Lycra, Kevlar, Nomex, Mylar. The company that had once made black powder for muskets was now making the materials from which the modern world was constructed. DuPont's slogan for much of this era was "Better Living Through Chemistry." It was not ironic. It was a genuine corporate philosophy. The company's own toxicology laboratory began finding uncomfortable results almost immediately after Teflon production scaled up. In 1951, DuPont began using a chemical called perfluorooctanoic acid, known internally as C8, to stabilize the Teflon manufacturing process. C8 made the production smoother and more consistent. It also turned out to be extraordinarily persistent in the environment and in the human body. DuPont's internal testing by 1961 had already linked C8 to an large livers in rats and rabbits. The company's own toxicology section chief reported that the material should be handled with extreme care and that contact with the skin should be strictly avoided. DuPont did not disclose these findings publicly. It did not inform regulators. It did not tell the communities near its manufacturing plants. By 1984, internal monitoring had detected C8 in public drinking water on both sides of the Ohio River near DuPont's Washington Works plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Company executives met to discuss what to do. The notes from that meeting document a conclusion that available methods for cutting pollution were not economically attractive. The company continued production. The contamination continued. C8 entered the drinking water of communities in Ohio and West Virginia at levels the company's own scientists considered concerning. None of them were told. By the time the full scope of the contamination became public through litigation in the early 2000s, DuPont had dispersed approximately 2.5 million pounds of C8 from the Parkersburg plant alone. The chemical is now detectable in the blood of more than 98% of Americans. It is found in the blood of seals and dolphins in the middle of the North Pacific. It will remain in the environment for thousands of years. In 2005, the Environmental Protection Agency fined DuPont $16.5 million for its decades-long concealment of the health hazards of C8. It was the largest fine the EPA had ever imposed. The company's revenues that year were in the billions. The family that had paid 40 workers' widows out of its own pocket in 1818 had become something quite different by the time the 21st century arrived. Chapter 5. The man who killed an Olympian. John Eleuthère DuPont was born on November 22, 1938, in Philadelphia. He was the youngest of 4 children of William DuPont Jr. and Jean Lissiter Austin. His parents divorced when he was 2 years old. He grew up on the 800-acre Lissiter Hall farm in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, with his mother and the estate's domestic staff. The childhood was one of extreme privilege and profound isolation. John's playmates were largely the children of the estate's workers. He had no real peers. He graduated from Haverford College in 1957. He developed serious interests in ornithology, conchology, swimming, and eventually wrestling. He poured money into each interest with the abandon of someone who had never encountered a constraint. He donated specimens to natural history museums. He sponsored swimming teams. He collected firearms extensively. He drank heavily. In the 1980s, he transformed his estate, renamed Foxcatcher Farm after his mother's racing stables, into a world-class wrestling training facility. He recruited Olympic-caliber wrestlers by offering stipends, housing, and access to training resources that the underfunded world of American amateur wrestling could not otherwise provide. He established Team Foxcatcher, one of the few elite amateur wrestling programs in the country. Dave Schultz was a 1984 Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling. He moved to Foxcatcher Farm with his wife and children to train for the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. He was, by many accounts, the only person who could manage John DuPont's increasingly erratic behavior with patience and consistency. After John's mother died in 1988, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He began speaking of seeing ghosts in the walls. He demanded to be introduced as the Dalai Lama at a World Championship wrestling event. He accused people of being Russian spies. He claimed Disney characters were hiding on his property. He removed all the treadmills from the training facility because he believed they were turning back time. He fired rounds into a flock of geese because he had become convinced they were using dark magic against him. None of this prompted intervention from the people around him. He was a DuPont. He was the facility's benefactor. He was the person whose money kept the program running. On January 26, 1996, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, John DuPont drove to Dave Schultz's house on the estate grounds. Schultz walked toward the car. DuPont fired 3 times. The 3rd bullet hit Schultz in the back. He died at the scene. DuPont retreated to his mansion. A 2-day standoff with law enforcement followed. Police eventually cut off the estate's heat during a cold winter weekend. DuPont came outside to check the boiler. He was arrested. The trial took place in January of 1997. The jury found him guilty of 3rd-degree murder but mentally ill. He was sentenced to 13 to 30 years in prison. He died at the State Correctional Institution at Laurel Highlands in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, on December 9, 2010. He was 72 years old. He remains the only member of the Forbes 400 Richest Americans ever convicted of murder. Chapter 6. What the Empire Left Behind. The DuPont family lost formal control of the company Irene, founded on the Brandywine in the early 1960s, when the Supreme Court ordered DuPont to divest its holdings in General Motors over antitrust concerns. The family's direct corporate power had already been diluting through each generation, spread across more than 3,500 living relatives by the time the 21st century arrived. In 2015, DuPont and the Dow Chemical Company announced a merger. The combined entity, renamed Dow DuPont, subsequently split into 3 separate companies in 2019. None of them is called DuPont in the form that Irene would recognize. None of them is controlled by his descendants. What the family left is complicated to measure. The nylon stocking, the Teflon pan, the Kevlar vest that stopped a bullet, the Lycra in the athlete's suit, the explosives that built the Transcontinental Railroad and blasted the channels of the Panama Canal, the gunpowder that armed the Union Army. Also, the C8 in the blood of nearly every American alive, the contaminated drinking water in Ohio and West Virginia, the decades of concealment, the cattle that died in a West Virginia rancher's fields because a creek had turned black and smelly from a landfill full of chemicals the company described as non-hazardous. Also, a dead Olympic wrestler in a driveway in Newtown Square. Also, a family that married cousins to keep the fortune concentrated, that split apart when cousins betrayed each other over a share price, that produced men who built estates along the Brandywine and named them after French locations, and filled them with art and gardens, and who occasionally produced someone like John DuPont, who had everything the fortune could provide and nothing that money could actually buy. The family fortune today is Estee, mated at approximately $14 billion, distributed across more than 3,500 living relatives. The Brandywine Mills are a museum. You can walk through the stone buildings where the powder was made and the explosion of 1818 killed 40 men. The house on the hill above is preserved. The family that lived there for 150 years is scattered across Delaware and Pennsylvania. Irénée DuPont named his mill in honor of freedom. He had fled a revolution that guillotined his mentor Lavoisier and nearly killed his father. He understood what it meant to lose everything. What he could not have known, standing on the banks of the Brandywine in 1802 with a French chemistry education and a vision of what American gunpowder could be, was what his fortune would produce 2 centuries later. All the nylon and the Teflon and the Kevlar, all the wars it armed, all the water it poisoned, and at the end of the line of his descendants, a man with a gun in a driveway on a cold January afternoon, firing at the only person who had ever been patient enough to manage him,